First of all, on behalf of my colleagues at the Danube Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this event. We have been, I won't talk to any length about the Institute. We've now been in existence for 4 years. We exist in order to hold conferences, debates, discussions on matters of importance, and it's hard to imagine a matter of greater importance in historical terms and even in moral terms today than the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. It would be nice to think that after 100 turbulent and murderous and terrible years, that people were well informed about the Bolshevik Revolution and the 100 years that followed. But in fact, it's possible, I think, for a student today in Western Europe and the United States of America to go through 4 years of education in good colleges without being given a really good knowledge of the history of the revolution and of communism. If such a student has prejudices that favor that revolution, they are far more likely in many great universities to be confirmed and set in concrete rather than disturbed. And in the words of the late Jean Kirkpatrick, institutions like universities are sometimes what she called islands of totalitarianism in a sea of freedom. Now, governments are not immune to this. And we have to say that many governments in the West have really not wanted to give great attention to the history to the events of this week and what they commemorate. When, for example, in Britain, the undoubtedly distinguished historian Eric Hobsbawm was made a Companion of Honour, which is, I think, the second highest award the British government gives. Despite the fact that in a television interview with Michael Ignatieff, he had said that the murder of millions of people was justifiable if it was inspired by hopes of a better world, there was surprisingly little protest. In fact, I think one of our panelists today, David Pryce Jones, was one of the few people who really expressed anger and disgust about that. The truth of the matter is that the West has never truly confronted the radical evil of communism as it has confronted the radical evil of Nazism. Both left and right have their reasons for not remembering the past as communism imploded in front of them. The right wanted a smooth diplomatic resolution of the Cold War and therefore avoided anything that smacked of Nuremberg, crimes against humanity, justice, or as the smooth evasion had it, Western triumphalism. The left needed to throw a cloak over its own sympathy on occasion and support on occasion for the Soviet experiment, and over the family resemblances between democratic socialism and really existing socialism. You may recall there were mass graves were discovered throughout the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But the coverage of them, though it occurred, was sketchy, perfunctory, and the matter was soon consigned to Orwell's memory hole. And as memories fade further, so there is a greater willingness to look, so to speak, on the brighter side of totalitarianism. A recent series commemorating the anniversary in the New York Times did so in many of its articles as a noble experiment conducted in less than ideal conditions. And with the recent upsurge of revolutionary left politics across Europe and in Britain, there is a leading figure in the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn's senior aide, Seamus Mill, who has on record as giving a very low estimate, 799,000 victims of Stalin's, people murdered by Stalin. And Mr. Mill went on to conclude, for all its brutalities and failures, communism in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe and elsewhere delivered rapid industrialization, mass education, job security, and huge advances in social and gender equality. If you look at the celebrations, not use that word really, but if you look at the way in which 1917 is being commemorated in several countries, you will see that it is an odd mix. It is ambiguous. On the one hand, you have lectures on the terrible events and the mass murders, the genocide, and so on. On the other hand, you also have modernist sculptures, concerts of Russian revolutionary music, and special vodka cocktails, as well as some lectures on Bolshevism by the few remaining true believers. What's also interesting is that how ambiguously, every bit as ambiguously, the 1917 is being celebrated in Moscow. As Gleb Pavlovsky, one of Putin's former political technologists, told The Guardian, it will be portrayed simultaneously as a great event and as a terrible tragedy. And of course, that is, to some degree, the result of the fact that Mr. Putin is probably not very much in favor of the concept of revolution at the moment. As for the victims of communism, they risk, as they've risked all along, being airbrushed out of history, in much the same way as Bolshevik leaders were airbrushed and non-personed out of photographs after their status changed. The mass murders carried out by communist regimes around the world, but especially in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, have caused only a handful of communist leaders in the Soviet bloc and some small fry like border guards who shot escapers to face punishment for committing or assisting in one of the greatest crimes in human history. Most former apparatchiks live better lives today than those of the people they once misgoverned, and their sympathizers in the West, mainly but not entirely on the left, seek to smother interest in the crime by, among other tactics, arguing that those raising it are prompted by a desire to relativize the Holocaust. Of course, neither the Holocaust nor the Gulag should be cited to relativize the other. Each is a unique historical crime, but both deserve to be remembered and their victims mourned. The opportunity to do this is given to, in a sense, redress the West's amnesia, is provided by the 100th anniversary. This is such a world historical event that everybody has to treat it seriously and in depth, and any such examination cannot avoid condemnation. Attempts to ensure that tens of millions of communism's victims finally receive some sort of justice, even if posthumously, have been launched and should command our attention. In Brussels, a conference asking the question, why was there not a Nuremberg for communism, was held last week in the European Parliament under the auspices of the European Conservatives and Reformers group of MEPs. It was also supported by several organizations devoted to remembering victims of the Gulag and the victims of the show trials. In Washington this week, Neil Ferguson and Natan Sharansky will be among the speakers at what promises to be, which is taking place now, in fact, a historic conference on truth, justice, and memory, organized by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Last night, here in Budapest, Professor Robert Service, who appears on our program later, delivered the Robert Conquest Memorial Lecture in honor of one case of one distinguished Russian historian delivering a eulogy to another. It was Conquest who was among the first people to document the scale and horror of Stalin's purges and the forced Ukrainian famine. And here today we have a number of distinguished speakers who will be addressing different aspects of these matters. I've asked people through the Danube Institute and through National Review to let us know of other commemorations of the victims or of events memorializing the revolution. This is important. From their unquiet graves, the victims of communism cry out to heaven, not for vengeance, but for justice. And we can't give that to them, but we can give them and their families the assurance that they have not been forgotten by history until justice arrives in a higher court. Now, our first session today is in fact about how communism ended, making the rest of the conference a kind of series of flashbacks. But communism ended extremely abruptly and in a way mysteriously. Now, I don't think there is a genuine mystery there, but it is interesting how within a very short time we went in the West, we went from being very nervous of communism and of the Soviet Union as a power that was still capable of causing us real trouble in the late 70s and early 80s, to kind of standing there with slight amazement as the system just imploded visibly, and fortunately not as bloodily as empires usually end. So we have two very distinguished participants and observers in the event of the end of communism and in our first panel. We have, first of all, David Pryce Jones. He will speak first. And Mr. Pryce Jones is a novelist, a critic, a historian, and probably is wearing several other hats if I could think of them. But he is somebody who wrote, I think, almost the first book which looked at what happened in 1989 to 1991, and did so by going to the people who were running the show until suddenly the show collapsed beneath them. He interviewed the people who had, in a sense, presided over the collapse of communism in his book. He's written many other books on the Middle East, Arab culture, but this is a book where I think earns him a really important place among historians of communism, because it's an examination of why and how it eventually failed. After David, Charles Crawford, a distinguished British diplomat who was ambassador to, among other countries, Poland and Serbia. He was involved in the negotiations that led to the end of the post-Yugoslav civil wars. And he was then appointed, earlier was appointed to be the Foreign Office man in charge of the transition from communism to free market, to free societies in this part of the world. So both were intimately, one as an observer, one as a participant, were involved in the topic of our first discussion. So let me begin by asking David Pryce Jones to talk to us. I think David will address from where he is.
I'm not very good with these. Can you hear me? Well, I want to thank John O'Sullivan for the kind words he's just said, and also the Danube Institute for inviting me. I first came to Budapest a few days after the 1956 uprising, and I'd like to begin by mentioning some names of people who were important to me at that time. Paul Maleta, General Bela Kirai, Sándor Kopacsi, and my old friend Paul Ignotus, who came to live in London, and who, in his escape from Hungary into Austria, his wife lost a child that she was carrying. I think we should remember them. And if somebody had said to me in December 1956 that a day would come when I would be addressing a Hungarian audience about the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would have thought the doctors would have to come and take such a person away for psychiatric treatment. It was an inconceivable thought when the Soviet tanks were in the street at that time. Now, a biography has just been published of Gorbachev by William Taubman, who's a distinguished American criminologist who wrote a biography of Khrushchev. And at the opening pages, he says that Gorbachev was a tragic hero. And he finishes about page 490 by repeating that Gorbachev was a tragic hero. What does that mean? I think it means that he had noble thoughts that he tried to execute and couldn't manage to do so. And that is what the tragedy lies in. Now, I have great trouble believing Gorbachev's democratic credentials. In the second of his meetings with Mrs. Thatcher, he said how do you know what to charge people? So Mrs. Thatcher drew a deep breath and she said, well, there's the cost of labor, the cost of raw materials, there's overheads, profit margins. And he said, but somebody must tell them what to charge. So Mrs. Thatcher got a team of people, one of whom was a great friend of mine, to draw up a little memorandum of how indeed capitalism works. And what Gorbachev's response to that was, I don't know. He was caught, wasn't he, between two forces operating in the world. He was caught between an international force, which was communism, and a national force, which was nationalism. They are incompatible. Somebody one day was going to have to meet that crisis and solve it. It looked a very distant future. The only people who thought that the Soviet Union might collapse were either Soviet dissidents like Amalrik or Vladimir Bukovsky, or Malcolm Muggeridge in London and Bernard Levin, the journalist, and I think they were more hit than miss. But there it was. Gorbachev was caught in the clash between those two. Stalin had tried to resolve it by having, in his day, communism in one country. And he was dealt a lucky card in Hitler's invasion, that he could present communism as being Mother Russia on the defensive against an invasion. And that postponed the crisis. Now, Gorbachev was born in 1930, I think. And he's one of those strange people who, both his grandparents, his grandfathers, I mean, were arrested and imprisoned in Stalin's day, and he didn't pay any attention to that. It didn't make him an enemy of communism. Those are strange people. I met one called Werner Eberhard, who'd been on the German Central Committee of the Communist Party, and his father and his two uncles had been murdered in 1937, and he thought that that was good and right and proper. I know that if my father had been murdered for political reasons, I wouldn't think well of it. Now, he goes to Moscow as a law student, and he joins the Komsomol in 1952. That's a giveaway, it seems to me. He must have known what was going on in the Kremlin. He must have known Stalin's latest post-war persecutions. He still felt it was the right thing to do to join the Komsomol. He also then makes friends with the right people. He attaches himself principally to Andropov, who distinguished himself, if that's the right verb, here in 1956 in the Soviet embassy. And he attaches himself to Suslov, one of the really hard ideological men. And he climbs that ladder through those two people and their team. I think that tells us a great deal about his inner belief in communism. Now, Marxism-Leninism has an infallibility built into it. It believed it had got the secret of history. You got the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis, and all the rest of it. And it was impossible to challenge that. They used the word, if you remember, scientific, as though the thing was beyond verification. It had already been verified. That means that anybody who objects to anything is at once challenging the infallibility of the regime's ideology. And the regime built up a formidable apparatus to stop any such challenges. There were block warders who supervised the people who lived in that block. There were factory warders who supervised the people who worked in the factories. There were union leaders. A man like Fadayev, who ran the writers' union, was really just a policeman. And you were made to confess that you'd made a mistake. You had to stand up in public and say, I wish I hadn't said it, and so you might be thrown out of the party, you might be thrown out of your job. And if you persisted, there were greater degrees of persecution. You might in the end be arrested, you might then be deported to Gulag, and you might then even be murdered. So all along the way, there was the danger of somebody saying, I don't agree with you. That led to schism. And if you read Lenin, you see that the danger that he's always saying, the only danger to the party is schism, factionalism, another word for it. Because, again, if the party is infallible, who am I to say, wait a minute, something is going to happen that you haven't thought about and that you haven't predicted? And then you have schism. Now, schism has got to be prevented by all costs. Think in your minds of the photographs of the Central Committee. 2,250 people, all with their hand up, voting exclusively on the same proposition, all dressed alike, all identical people. No possible sign of schism there. Now, when Gorbachev gets elected to the Politburo is a very dangerous place because that is where there are only a dozen people or so on it, and that is where schism could happen. Somebody says, we must be nice to the Germans, and the other man says, no, we must not be nice to the Germans. And then what? One or other of these people is going to lose. And that can be a very dangerous and tricky business. I mean, the most obvious big schism in the Soviet Union was Stalin and Trotsky. But then there's Khrushchev and Beria, and so it goes down all through society where there are these tests of strength. Who's the stronger? Whose opinion will actually win? And whose opinion we can then say is Marxist-Leninist? Now, when Gorbachev was elected, everybody said he was a hard man. If you remember, Gromyko said he has a nice smile, but his teeth are made of iron. And that's what I thought. I never believed that Gorbachev was any serious reformer. I didn't think that he understood what perestroika and glasnost would do. Glasnost opened the road to nationalism. You could write things that previously you hadn't been allowed to write. I think Gorbachev thought that nobody would do what the Baltics did and raise the injustices that had been done to them. Solzhenitsyn was not part of his vision. Now, perestroika. What did he change? He began, if you remember, by trying to suppress the sale of alcohol. And he discovered that that was too costly and it couldn't be done. The Popular Front started in 1989 in all the Soviet republics because of glasnost. And it presented Gorbachev with a very simple choice. He either had to suppress them or let them happen. As far as I could understand, he couldn't make up his mind which to do. There were quite a lot of party secretaries, ideological secretaries, who wanted to use force. Now, every single general secretary of the Communist Party before Gorbachev would have put down these uprisings with live ammunition. They'd have shot a lot of people. And I was expecting that I would open the newspaper one day and see that some unfortunate place had been chosen by Gorbachev to make an example, and the troops had opened fire, and there were 1,000 or 10,000 dead. The Shah said, by the way, that he only had to kill 5,000 people to keep the throne in Persia. So perhaps Gorbachev only needed to kill 5,000 people. But when he didn't do it, I felt I had to go and ask the ideological secretaries why he hadn't done it. So I went around all the Soviet republics. I came here to Budapest to talk to János Berec, who'd been the party ideological secretary. He was the author of Counter-Revolution in Hungary in 1956, the standard Soviet interpretation of the Hungarian uprising. He couldn't tell me why he'd become a communist at that time, and he couldn't tell me why he was now a businessman. He just was lost for words. But it was quite plain that he'd gone one day with his colleague in the Czech Republic, Wojtik, and they had decided that they would appeal to Gorbachev to use force. So that was two of the republics that might have used force. In fact, under Gorbachev, there were casualties in a lot of places: Tbilisi, Riga, Estonia. So there was a kind of submerged use of force. Gorbachev's major mistake, I think, was in failing to understand that in communist politics, he had to win the test of strength. And there came to be a proper man to test that, and that was Yeltsin. Gorbachev had the chance in 1987, I think, to kill Yeltsin, and if not kill him, exile him, get him sacked from the party committee, get him sacked from everything that Yeltsin was on, and send him like Malenkov had been sent to some, I don't know, flour mill on the Mongolian border, where he can't do any trouble at all. And I think Gorbachev thought he'd got rid of Yeltsin. But under Perestroika, Gorbachev allowed the Russians to have a communist party. There had never been a Russian communist party. There'd been a Soviet one, and communist parties in all the republics. But suddenly there was a Russian party and a Russian Duma. And Yeltsin suddenly was in a position to make a comeback to Gorbachev. He was alive. Now, it's not a very nice thing to be saying that if Gorbachev had actually shot Yeltsin or had him shot, I think communism would still be applicable today. I think we'd still have communism. Look at how much money is stolen out of Russia every year. It's 20 or 25 billion is appropriated by oligarchs and whoever. That could have kept communism going for a good long time. But instead of that, there was this test of strength between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, an old-fashioned test of strength to see who would win. Now, there were a lot of people who wanted a hard solution and were quite prepared to kill Gorbachev. Ligachev, Boris Pugo, Chebrikov, the KGB, conspirators. And they set about, if you remember, the counter-revolution of 1991. That was Yeltsin's moment. That was the test of strength that mattered. Yeltsin went down to where the tanks were, the Soviet tanks, and stood on a tank and made a speech. And behind the scenes, he made a telephone call. He rang up General Pavel Grachev, and he said, "Pavel, what are you going to do with your tanks? Are you going for Gorbachev or for me?" And Yeltsin's description, he says, there was silence on the telephone for a very long time. And eventually Grachev said, "I'll back you." So I think the person who really gets the credit for overthrowing communism is General Pavel Grachev. I'll finish by telling you, giving you an anecdote. Gorbachev, after he was out of power, went to Israel. And the professor of politics at the Hebrew University, Shlomo Avineri, who's a very old friend of mine and tells me this story, had the task of showing Gorbachev around the country. And it was a hot day. And they're walking at Ramat Rachel, which is outside Jerusalem. And Shlomo says to Gorbachev, "Wouldn't you like to sit down and have a rest?" "Yes." Gorbachev sits down, fans himself with his hat, and Shlomo says to him, "Tell me, when you were running the Soviet Union, what happened?" And Gorbachev said, "Well, I'll certainly tell you what happened. We knew the figures they gave us were wrong, and we thought they were wrong by 50% either way. What we didn't know was that they were completely made up. Now, how do you run a country like the Soviet Union if all your figures are false?" So my final thought was, in writing that book, that really the end of communism was a gigantic accident. And thank God for that, because if it had been planned by the Americans, who knows what would have happened. Now, John mentioned the mystery. Here, the most mysterious and lasting mystery, I think, is the unification of Germany. We don't know why Gorbachev formed his German policy of total surrender, but he did. He gave Eastern Germany to Chancellor Kohl unconditionally. He asked for nothing in return. So I knew Valentin Falin quite well. He was the German advisor of Gorbachev. And I asked Falin to explain Gorbachev's decision. And he said, well, Chancellor Kohl came, and he was 50 hours in Stavropol, in Gorbachev's district, and they went for a walk in the woods, another walk in the woods. And I had rung up Gorbachev, and I had said, under no circumstances can you allow Germany to be reunited and NATO stationed in East Germany. Under no circumstances. If that happens, and if the Americans take a hard line about it, you must declare an emergency, a nuclear emergency. You must close the borders. You must threaten everything that's possible, because we cannot have a united Germany in NATO. All right, says Gorbachev, I hear you. All we know is that he went for a walk with Chancellor Kohl, and he gave away East Germany unconditionally, with no restriction on NATO. Falin rang up Gorbachev and said, what have you done? And Gorbachev said, the train had already left the station. So I said to Falin, what is your explanation of this? Is it bribery? And Falin said, I do not know, but I do not exclude the possibility. So that is a very great mystery, but at least it didn't happen. The crisis that I had anticipated would have led, I think, to a much greater crisis than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we can thank whoever is the providence that we were spared. Let me just finish with a quotation from academician Petrakov, who was one of Gorbachev's advisors. And he said, I draw a parallel with Columbus, who discovered America, but to the end of his days, believed it was India. Thank you very much.